Welcome, listeners, to Together with Feeding New York State. I'm Ryan Healy,
And I'm Melissa Harry-Nannon.
and today we're excited to be joined by Taylor Pate and Ribka Getachew from Community Food Advocates. Both Ribka and Taylor lead New York's Good Food Purchasing Program campaign and are close friends of Feeding New York State. Ribka, Taylor, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So first we want to kick it off by just asking if you could tell us a little bit more about Community Food Advocates and the work that you guys do.
Of course. So CFA, or Community Food Advocates, is a nonprofit organization that's based here in New York that works at the intersection of high impact food policies and coalition building. So all of our program areas are guided by the strength and the breadth of our coalitions. We have a number of program areas, and all of those program areas are informed by our sort of central ethos that access to quality food is an essential human right. We know that lack of access to food is an income equity issue that's compounded by systemic racial and gender-based barriers, among so many others. And we believe that our government has a unique fundamental responsibility and an unmatched capacity to end poverty and ultimately one of its consequences, which is hunger. So to that end, we advocate for an array of high-impact public policies that ensure that all New Yorkers have access to healthy, affordable, plentiful, and culturally relevant and appropriate foods.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Ribka. I mean, and just that central ethos about food as a basic human right is certainly something that, that we share here at Feeding New York State. So could you tell us, just set the stage for our listeners a little bit. Tell us more about values-based food procurement.
Sure. So values-based food procurement, in short, is really the practice of purchasing food beyond simply thinking about the criteria of price, but rather purchasing from suppliers like farmers and distributors that meet a certain set of values, such as environmental sustainability or achieving fair working conditions for workers. The program that's really inspired the work that we are doing at Community Food Advocates with our New York State Good Food Purchasing Coalition is one called the Good Food Purchasing Program. It's a national model that really transforms the way public institutions like schools and hospitals, jails and senior centers purchase food by creating a transparent, equitable food system built on a set of core values. And these values include purchasing from local farmers and regional producers, nutrition, a valued workforce, which is really supporting producers that are allowing workers to unionize, providing safe working conditions, animal welfare, environmental sustainability, and transparency. And so this program is just one such values-based procurement kind of model that really it provides a set of comprehensive set of tools, technical support, and a verification system to help support institutions in meeting their purchasing goals. And it ultimately inspires a lot of the work that we're doing around what is known as the Good Food New York Bill.
That's awesome. Thank you, Taylor, so much for providing that background context. And it really seems like exactly what you're saying. Values-based food procurement is hitting at some of those systemic issues that Ribka was mentioning earlier too. So getting more into the Good Food New York bill, you talked a little bit about the values that you're looking to support. Can you talk a little bit more about this bill generally and why it's so timely?
Yeah, of course. So here in New York State, we have incredibly restrictive and antiquated procurement law, which is essentially law that's set on the state level that governs how agencies and institutions purchase food for the general public. These are specifically public entities like the schools, hospitals, jails, and senior centers that Taylor mentioned that use public taxpayers' dollars to buy food. And the Good Food New York bill is specifically amending a particularly restrictive part of procurement law, which is General Municipal Law 103, which is essentially a law in our state that dictates purchasing decisions by those public institutions and essentially requires that in most cases, when purchasing food and other products, those municipalities and institutions are required to buy from the lowest bidder, what's called the lowest bidder. But the Good Food New York bill the Good Food New York bill gives us another option. It ultimately helps cities and school districts and other public institutions think differently about how they use their purchasing power, and apply those dollars to 6 different values that really tap into the power of our food system. So again, those are strong local economies, protecting our environment, upholding workers' rights, animal welfare, nutrition, and racial equity. And again, the bill itself, the Good Food New York bill, really does reflect on and build on the values of the National Good Food Purchasing Program model, which has been groundbreaking in that it's supported over 63 institutions across the country elevate these food system values and support public institutions in shifting their food purchasing decisions to reflect these good food values. But the time is now. We need this bill right now because we know that public dollars, our public food dollars in particular, are currently supporting the largest food agribusinesses and corporations, and they ultimately control so much of our supply chain. We know as I think most of us have experienced throughout the pandemic, that our supply chains are incredibly fragile, especially when so much of the control of food exists at the top of our supply chains amongst these very large and few corporations. So we know that with these types of supply chain monopolies, that these vulnerabilities are inevitable and that there are fewer supports in place to mitigate interruptions. We've seen also that labor shortages or transportation issues ultimately lead to processing facilities being shuttered, wasting product, and us on our end, customers being left with fewer options and higher prices, as I think we're all experiencing. We also just experienced that these big corporations cut a ton of corners on food quality, on labor, the environmental impacts, while also undercutting local businesses' prices. And these corporations are ultimately profiting from the system, and many New Yorkers are being left behind, including communities of color and other vulnerable people that are going hungry, being denied a living wage while working in corporate food facilities and on farms and consuming the food, and also suffering from the impacts of pollution from these food operations. The Good Food New York bill, on one hand, would hold large vendors accountable to better practices, while also ensuring that small and historically marginalized vendors like BIPOC producers, which are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color farmers and food producers, have more opportunities to contract with our public agencies and enter into that institutional marketplace to feed their communities.
Ribka, that's super helpful in sort of understanding, first of all, even just understanding the way that the food system interacts with some of the major issues of our time. So whether you're thinking about things like, living wages and workers' rights, whether you're thinking about racial equity or environmental sustainability, et cetera, the need to build up local systems in general, it sounds like what you're trying to do is to leverage public dollars to better support these value areas so that producers are not just meeting the bare minimum regulatory standards, but are going above and beyond to more urgently transform the food system. So let's talk through that a little bit. So how would the Good Food New York bill specifically enable municipal institutions to adopt values-based food procurement?
So, as Ribka mentioned, at the heart of the Good Food New York bill, it really helps cities and school districts and these public institutions think differently about the power of their purchasing policies. And it puts these core values that we've mentioned at the center: strong local economies, protecting the environment, workers' rights, animal welfare, nutrition, and racial equity. The bill, in short, would allow for a bid to be awarded to a qualified vendor. So that's a farmer or distributor or supplier who responds to a bid that meets one or more of the values-based criteria. And that criteria is one of the 6 value areas that we've mentioned before. And so essentially, if a vendor or farmer meets one of these criteria and the bid that they respond with isn't greater than 10% higher than the cheapest bidder, then they could be preference for a contract. So in lieu of the kind of current status quo in which vendors or which must have the cheapest bid in order to be awarded a contract. This really allows for flexibility for municipalities to be able to opt into working with vendors and farmers that are aligned with these food systems values.
That's awesome. And I really appreciate just hearing more in depth exactly how municipalities could make this work for them. And so I'm curious to know what the feedback has been from municipalities.
Thanks so much for that question. We have gotten a lot of support from municipalities, and to be honest, it's one of the very reasons why we embarked on, initially drafting and then advocating for the passage of the Good Food New York bill. We were seeing that municipalities were being incredibly restricted with how they were able to purchase food. We were also seeing that local governments were also restricted in with regards to passing local level policies to codify commitments to values-based food procurement. And so throughout the process of advocating for the Good Food New York bill, we've engaged a plethora of municipalities, local municipalities across the state, including in New York City, across the Hudson Valley, in Buffalo, and throughout New York State. And here in New York City, for example, we've had a longstanding relationship with our New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy. We initially began embarking on this process of implementing values-based food procurement practices here in New York City back in 2018. And that was a process that started with the Department of Education and has been growing ever since. And most recently, we've gotten a plethora of shows of support from municipalities across the state. So we've gotten sign-ons from entities like the Office of the Brooklyn Borough President, Antonio Reynoso, different food policy councils across the states, like the Food Policy Council of Buffalo and Erie County, as well as the Tompkins County Food Policy Council. And then we've also very excitedly gotten the support of Kamal Johnson, who's the mayor of the city of Hudson, as well as Jen Metzger, who's the Ulster County executive, Stephen Noble, who is the mayor of the city of Kingston. And I also forgot to mention the Rochester Food Policy Council as well.
Ribka, it's really exciting to see that degree of local support and support at the municipal level. That's really exciting. Sort of wondering how Good Food New York and this legislation aligns with some of Governor Hochul's food and nutrition priorities. Obviously, there's been a lot of programs, initiatives, and executive orders that are focused on New York agriculture, but I'm curious how this piece of legislation aligns with some of the governor's existing priorities.
Yeah, so we know, based on a number of policies that the governor has passed, she's really excited about supporting New York State farmers and growing kind of the local piece, really incentivizing institutions to be purchasing more New York State products. And one example of such is the 30% initiative, and it tends to encourage schools to source food from more local farmers in order to provide healthy meals to children while also supporting local economies. And in essence, if school districts purchase food with 30% eligible, New York produced and processed products, they can get a reimbursement for those meals. And so it really encourages schools to prioritize their purchasing from in-state farmers. And this aligns really well with the work of the Good Food New York bill, because of course, one of the priorities within the bill, one of the value areas that we are lifting up is the local economies piece. And so we think this is kind of naturally dovetails with the 30% initiative by incentivizing folks who are doing procurement within public institutions to purchase from these local producers. Additionally, it really aligns really well with the Nourish New York, which was created during COVID, in order to help food insecure folks access nutritious food while also providing a market for farmers to sell their products. And so essentially this funding allows emergency food providers in New York to continue to purchase surplus products from New York farmers and deliver it to folks who need it. And so again, this is really encouraging local purchasing from New York State farmers and producers. And lastly, one of the initiatives that executive orders that the governor recently called for was a directive to state agencies to increase their purchasing of food sourced from New York farmers and producers. And this is really critical because although the piece of legislation that we're working on, the Good Food New York bill, isn't directed at state agencies, it's directed at municipalities. This is doing very similar work in that it's encouraging these government agencies to increase their purchasing. And so we kind of see this as, again, just building on the momentum of some of the work that the governor is already doing to increase, in-state purchasing in New York.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. I'm so happy to hear about all of these initiatives and how it really runs parallel to that Good Food New York program, whether it be, like you said, the 30% initiative, Nourish New York, or that directive to state agencies. And again, going back to Good Food New York, I'm curious to know where that legislation stands today.
The Good Food New York bill actually passed in the New York State Legislature earlier this year in June of 2024 with overwhelming support. We had over 40 co-sponsors across both the Senate, the New York State Senate, and New York State Assembly. At this point, we are very close to the end of the year, and we're waiting on Governor Hochul to sign the bill into law. She actually has until the very end of this year to do so.
Thanks, Ribka. That's helpful in understanding, the timeline that you're working with to get the Good Food New York bill signed into law. So we have a really important last question for our listeners. So what's one call to action that you have for folks listening to this episode?
I really appreciate this question, and we really do need all hands on deck because the time to pass this bill is now. If we don't get it passed now, we're gonna have to, essentially start from scratch. So we really are hoping that all of the listeners today will take a couple of minutes of their time, at most maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and call on the governor. We have a call to action that makes it very simple to call Governor Hochul to lend your support for the Good Food New York bill. The call to action that we have also has embedded within it a call script that gives you the language to help inform your call, and also has an email template for you to also sort of click to email to key members of her office to just communicate that, this is why communities around New York are supportive of this bill, and more specifically, this is why constituents of Governor Hochul are supportive of the Good Food New York bill and want to see it signed today.
Thanks, Ribka, Taylor, and you heard it here, listeners. We're going to be sure to make this call to action available, so be sure to check out, the link in bio or the episode description for the relevant call to action. Taylor, Pate, Ribka, Getachew, lead organizers with New York's Good Food Purchasing Program campaign. Thanks so much for joining us today. And remember, listeners, together we can end hunger and poverty here in New York State. Thanks.
Thanks for having us.